Dartmouth, believe it or not. It's funny. I talked to Governor Sununu today, and he said to me, going up to Dartmouth, good luck. But I will tell you, the reception was really good, really respectful, really good questions. So I'm really, quite pleased that that we went up there and that we had the event that we did. Look, what I'd like to do tonight is just to change the format a little bit of what we normally do. And what I'd rather do is just take your questions. For some of you, you've heard me speak before, and I'll just say one quick thing and then go directly to your questions, because I think that'll be more informative for everybody. We're living in an extraordinarily dangerous time, and a time that is much more dangerous now than even was 3 weeks ago. And my view on it is that it makes character an even more important issue in this campaign, because we certainly didn't anticipate what was going to happen in Israel. And there's lots of things that are going to happen in this country and around the world that you can't anticipate. But what you need is to have a president who has the character to be able to deal with those problems in a way that's going to make you proud to have him represent your country and to make the decisions that we need to make for the country. So I think this is, an extraordinarily important time before the events of the last 3 weeks. Since the events of the last 3 weeks, it's now even more important. And, I think the people of New Hampshire need to focus on that and focus on it in a way that takes everybody's character into consideration for what we're going to be considering over the course of the next 10 or 11 weeks before we get to the primary. So I'm happy to be here, and what I want to do more than anything else is hear from you and take your questions, and that'll lead to, I think, a really good conversation tonight. So who wants to start? Any question about anything? Yes, sir.
Was doing a live seminar for, I think it was Morgan Stanley, and she took us around the world, honestly, from Gaza to college kids. And I'm curious what your reaction is. She says she was very optimistic because of the youth today in America, who she thinks are much more involved than prior generations. I'm just curious what you observed with your Dartmouth audience.
Well, let me say this. First off, Condi would know, since she's on a college campus every day, and in her association with Stanford and her teaching there, so she gets to see the college folks every day. I would say that, just the experience at Dartmouth, I got to the auditorium, and I don't know, how many people did that auditorium seat, guys? 240? Okay, so there were 240, all the seats were filled, and there were probably another 40 or 50 students waiting outside to get in. And eventually, as some people had to leave, we were able to get standing room and everything else, get everybody in that wanted to be in. So first off, to think about that, on a Thursday afternoon in the beginning of November, to get them all to show up. And they had really good questions, and they were really engaged and involved. And then almost all of them stayed afterwards to come up and talk to me personally and to get pictures taken. And so, I think it is really encouraging. What I said to them, and which was not, I didn't plan as part of my opening conversation with them, was, I said, let's talk about free speech. Free speech is not free. Free speech costs something. It costs a lot of Americans their lives. Free speech is about treating each other and each other's opinions with respect. Showing respect and caring and love for each other. And that I was really concerned that on a lot of college campuses right now, that wasn't going on. And I'd have to say, I don't know whether it was because of their disposition up there or whether it was because I kind of pre-admonished them, but there was extraordinary respect in that room, and I think if you just watched this room, it was incredibly encouraging. And I do think this, from having children around this age. I have a daughter, our youngest daughter's now a junior at Notre Dame. Her friends are much more plugged in, even than I'd say her older sister, who's 7 years older, more plugged in than her friends were. And the difference between those 7 years has made a real noticeable difference. They both went to Notre Dame, so they were going with kind of similar students with 7 years between them. My daughter Bridget's class seems to be much more involved and plugged into what's going on in the world than Sarah's class did. So it's kind of interesting. It's an interesting observation from Condi, and I think when I think about it, I agree with it. I agree with it. Sure. Other questions from folks? Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I know Israel is in the headlines right now, but about Ukraine, like how do you plan on keeping Ukraine and other conflicts in the world relevant while everyone's focused on Israel right now, because there's still a war going on.
Sure.
I mean, you've probably seen there's a small faction of Republicans that want to remove funding for that.
Sure.
Like, how would you approach that when you become president?
Well, first off, let's remember it is still a minority faction in the Republican Party, but Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and Vivek Ramaswamy are in that minority who want to remove funding from Ukraine. Ramaswamy even said the other day he's willing to give all of the land Russia has stolen to Russia, and also to give Russia an agreement that we would never admit Ukraine to NATO in return for them breaking their ties with China. And how likely is that, right? This is like the naivete of the century. So, it's a conversation that I'm sure we're going to have Wednesday night on the stage in Miami, and we should. Look, I still think a majority of the Republican Party understands how important it is. And you talked right at the beginning of your question about something really relevant, and that is the distraction that the Israeli war has become to what's going on in Ukraine. And by distraction, I don't mean to minimize it at all. It was an intentionally done distraction. There's no doubt in my mind that those four countries are working together. I call them the foursome of evil: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. They're sharing weapons with each other. China's funding the war in Russia. The Iranians are giving drone technology to the Russians to use in Ukraine. And if we think for a second that Hamas decided just willy-nilly this might be a good time to go after Israel, I think it was given the green light by Iran in coordination with the Russian and Chinese allies to do exactly what you said at the beginning of your question, which is to try to distract us from our commitment to Ukraine so they can finish the Ukrainian war while we're helping Israel. We can do both at the same time, and we need to. And that's what a great power does. I had a woman ask me at a town hall recently, why is this our responsibility? And I said, well, there's a lot of technical reasons I could give you, but how about this one? This is the price we pay for being the richest and freest country in the world. And if we want to remain the richest, freest country in the world, we have to remain engaged. This idea that somehow, this America First stuff drives me crazy. First off, in this room, who's not for America First, right? Someone I'll go for the Netherlands first, Belgium second, and let's go America nice, comfortable third, right? No one feels that way. The question is not, should America be first? It's how. How do we do it? And I don't believe we've ever been able to do it by filling in the moat and pulling up the drawbridge and saying the rest of the world's not our problem. We've become this way because of our engagement in the world. We've come this way because we have alliances and friendships all around the world by the dozens more than the Chinese or the Russians have. And any friends they have to buy. And so we need to continue to remain engaged in the world. And so as president, I would make it really clear by my actions and my words that Ukraine was a priority. And what I would do is give the Ukrainians every weapon system they needed to finish the Russian army off and send them into retreat. That's it. I mean, when you think about it, we've spent 5% so far of 1 year of the Pentagon's budget in aid to Ukraine. 5% of 1 year, not of the U.S. budget, of just the Pentagon budget. And they've degraded 50% of the Russian military. There's a report last week in the Wall Street Journal that Russian generals were executing Russian soldiers who wanted to desert. We have them on the run. And the Iran Hamas attack on Israel is meant to distract us. When I went to Ukraine a little over 2 months ago now, I met with President Zelensky. The first thing he said to me was, whenever you meet with any group of Americans and Ukraine comes up, would you please tell them from me, thank you. Because without America's help, we would be occupied by Russia right now. And we've been occupied by Russia before, he said, and it was no fun. Secondly, he said to me, I want you to assure every American that we will never accept American soldiers in this war. He says, it's a point of national pride for us. We believe we can win this war with our soldiers. And we're not going to accept American occupation anymore than we're going to accept Russian occupation. And so here we have a country that is willing to fight this fight against the Russian army, degrade them and damage them. And what they want us to do is help supply them with the weapons to do it and not spill any American blood. I don't know, that seems like a pretty good return on investment to me. And that's what we should be doing and focused on. And folks like Ramaswamy and DeSantis and Trump, who are playing to the lowest common denominator in our party. It's wrong. And I'm going to continue to fight against it as president. I would make it very clear to the Russians, Ukraine is fighting this war with the full support of the United States government. And I think that will send the Russians heading back towards their border eventually. And some kind of negotiated settlement to end this thing, but not with giving them any of the land that they've stolen through this invasion. That's not right, and not something I would want to have happen. Yes, sir.
It makes sense to me that those 4 countries are deciding if we escalate the following those arms, there's not invite escalation of armament.
I think not, because I don't think the Chinese army is ready for that. We still have a pretty significant military advantage over China. I was talking to General Milley about this right before he retired. He's become a friend, and I asked him to for a briefing on what he thought. And he said, look, in 10 years, he said, the Chinese army might be our equal if we continue on the same path of kind of like this and they continue like that. But right now, he said they know that they don't have the wherewithal to keep up with us. And so I think that escalating those armaments sends a much different signal to them, which is, we know we still have the advantage, and we're going to deter you while we do. And then, of course, we've got to get to maintaining and expanding that advantage, because we will recognize what an important part it is to establishing world order, to establishing some sense of justice around the world in a way that inures to America's benefit. So, for instance, we need more ships in the Navy. We need more submarines to patrol the South China Sea, where the Chinese continue to build more artificial islands illegally against international law, and they're arming them to be military bases. We've got to be there and let them know that we're going to keep the trade lanes in the South China Sea open and free, not only for us, but for our allies in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And those are incredibly important trading partners to us and incredibly important strategic allies for us. Those things are things that we need to do, because believe me, if we won't, the Chinese will. They'll make deals with those countries, but the deals they'll make will be at the end of a pointed gun. The deals we make are at the end of an extended hand. And I think that's the difference. So I'm not worried about escalation now. The Russians are well occupied. The Iranians don't want to start that war with us. That will not end well for them. The same with the North Koreans. And the North Koreans will only do what the Chinese permit them to do. And if the Chinese don't want a war, they're not going to let the North Koreans go off and play in traffic. So I think we're in a pretty good position at the moment, but we've got to be able to force that position into a place where our allies know we'll stand with them. That will make them stronger too. And you got some of these neutral countries out there like India growing and getting stronger that don't know which way to go. Ally with the US or ally with China. It's over 1 billion people. I'd like them with us. So we got to make efforts to do that and let them know we're reliable partners. One of the things about Ukraine is in 1992, we promised we'd protect them if they returned the Soviet nuclear missiles to Russia. Well, the Ukrainians wanted to keep them. Why? Because they wanted to prevent what's happening right now. They figured if they had nukes, that would prevent them. But we didn't want the nuclear weapons to proliferate. So we urged them to send it back to Russia, and we said, if you do, and they invade you, we'll defend you. Well, we better be good to our word. And I think not keeping those promises, we've shown that that's created more tumult. Obama drawing the red line in Syria than not enforcing it. Biden's disastrous pullout from Afghanistan. Trump playing games with Ukrainian aid in return for getting dirt on Joe Biden, right? These are all things that send signals of weakness and division to our adversaries and embolden them to make the moves they've made. And I think we have to be strong and resolute about it. Let them understand that the next American president won't have any doubt about what America's role in the world is. And if we elect Donald Trump or anybody else in that group, there'll be significant doubt about what our role in the world will be. I said this earlier at Dartmouth because I got asked that question as well. The ceasefire right now is like if you're out on the playground in school and you get tapped on the shoulder, and as you turn around, a guy sucker punches you, knocks you on the ground, bloodies your nose, you stand up, and he says, truce, let's not fight. They got their shot in, and I think that the Israelis have to accomplish two things before there can be a ceasefire. First is to make sure that they are positioned to defend their territorial integrity and the safety and security of their people, because that obviously was something they did not do in the lead up to October 7th. And secondly, they have to take enough action against Hamas to degrade their ability to do this again in the near future. I can't make that judgment sitting from here as to how much is enough. But as long as we're continuing to communicate to the Israelis that that should be the goal, not to completely wipe out every human being on the Gaza Strip, but to degrade the Hamas military capability. And then third, to remind the Israelis that the long-term goal here is to finish what we've started in terms of isolating Iran. The agreements with the UAE, with Morocco, with Jordan, with Egypt, all have helped to isolate Iran even more. And if we can get an agreement with the Saudis, the Qataris, who's left to team with the Iranians? So don't do anything now at Gaza that will make it impossible for those countries to sign peace agreements with you. Keep the long-term goal in mind. Now, that kind of stuff should be being said privately to the Israelis, not publicly. And when the president today got heckled at some speech in Minnesota and said, okay, well, I'm for a pause now, that stuff shouldn't be being said publicly, because it emboldens our adversaries to think there's some daylight between us and Israel. If I were president of the United States, I'd be on the phone every day with Netanyahu, getting updates from him and reminding him that our support is unconditional, but don't make a mistake that we're all going to have to pay for, because then you may be paying for it on your own, not us. So I think that's the way to do it. I do think there needs to be permission of groups, non-government organizational groups, to go in there to provide humanitarian aid to people who are suffering. But we need to remember too, we got 250 or 60 hostages still being held by Hamas, and so they want humanitarian aid. It seems to me it should be timed to release of hostages. So you want 5 trucks of food? Good. Give me 50 hostages. I'll give you 5 trucks of food right now. You want 8 trucks of medical supplies? Great. Release another 50 hostages. We should be conditioning that upon them. They want humanitarian aid. We want humanitarian aid for those hostages. So let's be humanitarian on both sides of the line here. You can get the aid you need to make sure your people are fed and cared for in the hospitals, and you return these people that you kidnapped and took out of Israel, both Israelis and Americans. We need to get them out, and I think the only way to do that is to leverage the humanitarian aid to do it. And then we're going to find out how much they really care about their people. So it's a delicate thing, and that's why it's so dangerous right now, because one misstep could lead to a widening of the war. So that's why communication is so necessary. And we should be having regular communication, not only with Netanyahu, but directly with the IDF as well, the Israeli Defense Forces as well, so that we're, double checking on what we're being told. The Prime Minister may have one opinion about what's going on militarily. The IDF may have a different one, and we need to double check that. And keeping lines of communication open between the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Defense Minister in Israel are really, really important to do as well. So this is why you need an experienced, thoughtful person as president right now, and in the time to come. And that's why, it's no time for TV tough guys, who just bloviate all the time. Can't have that. It'll put us in an even more dangerous position. And I know Donald Trump. I've known him for 22 years. Let me tell you what he'll do. He'll capitulate every time. He will give Ukraine to Russia. He will force the Israelis into a premature, ceasefire and encourage Hamas. You heard him the other day say he thought Hezbollah was very, very smart and criticizing Netanyahu openly, publicly. And he's not criticizing Netanyahu because of the war. He's criticizing him because he called Biden and congratulated him on being elected president when Trump was taking the position that the election had been stolen, right? So, we need a president who's going to put the country first, not himself. And it's even more important now than it was a few weeks ago. Other questions? Anybody about anything? Yes, sir?
Talked about lowest common denominator. You talked about experienced, reasonable person. When you think about what happened in the House of Representatives in the last several weeks, how does that make you feel, differently or the same than it did before all that went down? About having somebody be the nominee of the Republican Party who is experienced and reasonable rather than just doing the lowest common denominator.
Look, our party is divided. It is. That often happens when you don't have a president. And when I look at what happened in the House, it just shows that we don't have enough serious people there who understand that their first job is to govern. And to shut down the House of Representatives for 3 weeks, to change from Kevin McCarthy to Mike Johnson. I don't know what you think, but I don't think it's going to be any material difference we're going to see in what's going to happen down there or not happen down there. I think we need a strong president who understands how to work with a legislature of a different party. When you have divided government, even the way it is there now, with one House Republican, the other House Democrat, it takes presidential leadership to bring those people together and force them to get something done. And that means the president has to sacrifice and risk his own political capital to get things done. But I got used to doing that for 8 years in New Jersey. I had a Democratic legislature every minute of every day that I was governor. And there were days it was really lousy. But what it taught me was how you have to do it, how you have to deal with other people. And you got to spend time with them. And you got to make relationships with them. This is still a people business. And I would aim to do the same thing as president with the Congress. You need to get to know them. And you need to use the bully pulpit to try to move them. I did that a lot in New Jersey too, where I moved the public towards me on a position, and all of a sudden they started to get a little more reasonable. We were able to make a deal. That's the way it works. But what we're doing right now, what we've been doing really ever since Obama, has been, only a deal on my terms. No matter who was in the White House, whether it was Obama or whether it was Trump. Biden's been a little better at that, to be fair, but still not nearly as much as he needs to be. And I think that's because he just didn't have the energy to do it. He looks tired. He looks every bit of 80 years old, maybe even older. And this takes a lot of time and a lot of energy to do and to get done. And so I do think we need a reasonable, experienced president who understands how to deal with those different factions. And they're on both sides of the aisle, as you know, by the way, because you got some real crazy people on the far left who are not interested in governing either, just interested in getting clicks on the internet and getting more donations into their campaign by setting their hair on fire, on CNN. It doesn't make any sense to govern the country. Our country was designed to be an argument, but only an argument that leads to a result not an argument just for the sake of arguing. And that's where we are now as a country, unfortunately. Arguments that lead to nothing, except more arguments. You and you and you and you. Like, look, that's what elections are for. And I don't believe that that's a majority of our party. In fact, if you look at Donald Trump's numbers here in New Hampshire, he's in the high 30s, low 40s. He's an incumbent, basically. And he's at like high 30s, low 40s in New Hampshire. If that were Biden in the high 30s or low 40s in the Democratic Party, they'd be, sending out the ambulance to take him off the field. Trump in the high 30s, low 40s, they go, look how dominant he is. Dominant? This guy should be in the 70s, 80s among Republicans as a two-time nominee. The majority of Republicans polled in this state don't want him. The question is, who will you coalesce behind? And we can't give up or give in. I'm certainly not. And I hope you don't either. Because if you give in, then I'm going home. And I don't want to do that because I think the stakes are much too important. So when you look at the numbers, don't just listen to the media commentary about it. Just look at the numbers. He's below 50% support in his own party. Even in Iowa, the poll that came out last week had him at 43. Yeah, it had him 27 points ahead of DeSantis. But so what? It's 43%. So it's eventually going to come around to a race that'll be one-on-one. And when it does, he's got real problems. And don't forget, he's going on trial. I mean, it's hard to even imagine this, right? But in 5 months, he's going on trial for obstructing Congress and lying about the election results. And now his own chief of staff is going to testify against him with immunity. I can't see. I did this for 7 years as the U.S. attorney in the 5th largest office in the country. I've done a lot of this. This is not ending well for him. He's going to be convicted. And he's going to be sentenced to jail. That's not the advertisement you want for your nominee. Vote for him so maybe he can pardon himself and keep him out of jail. I mean, it's ridiculous. We nominate him, we're going to lose. We're going to lose. And then Joe Biden will have a Democratic Congress because they'll take the House back. It's only a 5-seat majority now. And probably 4-seat because George Santos didn't get kicked out yesterday, but he ain't coming back. Right? I think that's a pretty safe bet, right? I don't think we're going to see George reelected. So we're down to a 4-seat practical majority. We lose the presidency, we're going to lose the House too. And then what are they going to do? They're going to pack the Supreme Court. They're going to admit Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as states, so we'll never have a chance to have a majority in the Senate again. Spend us into oblivion. There are real life things that will result from it. So don't give up. And don't worry about the polls. I'll remind you this about the polls is 8 years ago at this time in Iowa, Ben Carson was ahead by 10 points. October Des Moines Register poll, Ben Carson was ahead by double digits. 8 years ago in New Hampshire, Jeb Bush was ahead in October. See how that ended up. I had a friend of mine who works in the baseball industry call me today, check in on how I was doing. And I said, here's how I'm doing. November 1st in a presidential campaign is like August 1st in a baseball season. You're close, but there's still a lot of baseball to be played. There's still about 60 games left to play in a 162-game season. That's what we got here. We've got 12 weeks to go. 12 weeks from yesterday before anyone's voting here. So we still got time, but like in baseball, August are the dog days. These are the dog days. It's getting cold up here now. People are going to be slogging around soon in snow, and we're going to be feeling it. But it's about our country that we're trying to save. And so I won't give up on you. Don't give up on me. And don't give up on the cause, more importantly. Other questions for Peaks about anybody? Anything? Yes, sir.
So, first of all, good luck on the debate next week.
I'm looking forward to it. Should be fun.
I just want to ask, so Vice President Pence said that authoritarians, they only understand action, not like what you say. So, in spirit of that, like, I'm curious what your thoughts are, like, with Biden and Trump, who worked with, like, our U.S. partners like Singapore, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Will you change, like, your foreign policy or anything like that with those partners? Because, like, there are human rights concerns and there are, other issues. And I think Biden, like, is basically addressing human rights because he's, met with Vietnam recently. He's met with Saudi Arabia. So I think when Biden said he was going to put human rights as the forefront of his foreign policy, that actually turned out not to be true. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, look, I think that it's Joe Biden becoming realistic. Like, look, the Middle East is an awful neighborhood. I mean, think about it. It is an awful, awful neighborhood. But you can't ignore it. So, it's kind of picking among the bad choices. And look, I don't like Saudi Arabia's record on human rights, but it's a hell of a lot better than Iran's. Right? So, like, you got to make these judgments. This is what makes being president so hard, is that these are really tough judgments. But the absolutist position never works. If you don't do what we want to do on human rights, we won't talk to you. They'll say, okay, we'll go talk to the Russians and the Chinese. And you go, oh, don't do that. Well, what do you expect them to do? This is a big, cold, ugly world out there in many respects. And their smaller countries are looking for friends. Less influential countries are looking for friends. So friends can have good conversations with friends, though. And I think that, I don't like everything that's going on in Jordan, but I've known King Abdullah now for 10 years, and he can be spoken to. And you can have conversations with him where he'll do things a little bit differently in return for our friendship. And I think we have to engage with the Saudis, because we're not choosing the Saudis or the perfect country. We're choosing between the Saudis and the Iranians. All right, well, if that's my choice, I'm going with the Saudis. Doesn't mean they're great. But in certain bad neighborhoods in this world, we're forced to pick sides. And so that's part of it's just being practical. Now, we can always try and should continue to try to have influence on them in a positive way. And I think if you look at what's going on in Saudi Arabia today versus what was going on there a decade ago, it's getting better. I mean, women are driving now. Imagine 10 years ago they weren't allowed to do that. You're seeing more liberalization of the society in Saudi Arabia than could have been thought about a decade ago. And I think the pace of change is never fast enough for us, given that we're the most evolved democracy in the history of the world, even though it may not look like it every once in a while, very often. When you compare it to everybody else, we're pretty evolved. That's the tough choices you have to make. So human rights are always going to be a part of what we do, but they cannot be the tail that wags the dog. Because if they are, we're going to have to leave a lot else on the sidelines. And you saw, by the way, when Biden really ticked off the Saudis early in his term, and then we had, what'd they do? They cut back on the flow of oil. Because that's right? So, look at the way that works. I mean, we've got to get real about that. And that's, again, why experienced, mature people have to be making these calls, and not people who, are just going to pop off. Because when you do that and you're the United States of America, there's a huge cost that comes with that, and a risk that we then lose control of other events. And we wind up in the situation we're in Ukraine, and the situation we're in Israel. Then all of a sudden you're trying to balance a bunch of things as President of the United States that are outside of your control, but that you will be affected by. And you watch, we're all going to be affected by oil prices, in part because of the Biden policies on domestic production, and in part based on what's going on over in the Middle East. Oil prices are going to go up just in time for the winter. Shocking. They usually happen just in time for the winter and then just in time for the summer when we want to drive someplace. It's amazing how that happens. Other questions from anybody about anything? Yes, sir.
So, we talked about foreign aid helping Ukraine. We haven't talked about is we're borrowing money to do this. And, how are we gonna clean up the money? We're, you know, if I can't pay my light bill, I shouldn't be paying my neighbors.
Right. Yep. Look, the problem for us is the irresponsibility of the last 6.5 years predominantly. Of the 33 trillion in debt now, and it's an unthinkable number. Like, we don't even know what 33 trillion really means. We can write it out. We know what it really means. 13 trillion of it has been accumulated in the last 6 years. 7.8 trillion by Trump, and now another nearly 6 trillion by Biden. Now, you know, you just can't have that. Even when our economy grows really well, you can't keep up with that. So what would I do? I've diagnosed the problem. Congratulations. Now, what would you do about it, right? Look, when I became governor of New Jersey, I inherited an $11 billion deficit on a $29 billion budget. I became governor right after the Great Recession, 2009. And our state was in awful shape. And they all said you got to raise taxes. And we're one of the highest tax states in the country, as you already know. And I said I was going to do it. So I went to something called zero-based budgeting, which means that you tell every department to come in and list every program they have in their department and start it at zero. And then justify to me what you want to spend, rather than come in at what you're spending this year and justify how much more you want. Because we were in a desperate situation. What did that lead me to do? I eliminated 832 programs in my first year. And we balanced the budget without raising taxes. Now, it was ugly because there were no good choices in there, or at least very few. And my popularity went from 55% to 38% after I passed the budget, because every one of those programs had a constituency. So what we got to be prepared for as a country is, if you elect a president like me who's going to say no and is going to put that spending on a downward track, there's some of the things I'm going to do that you're going to be ticked off about. Hey, wait a second, I like that program. How do you get rid of his program? His stinks, but mine is really good. You got to be indiscriminate about it, and it's going to take every bit of 8 years to try to get it under control. This year's deficit is nearly $2 trillion, just this year. It just ended on October 31st. So my deficit was big, 11 billion of 29. Was like more than a third of the budget was deficit. But this is well beyond that. And so I'm going to be honest with you, like, I'm not going to fix that in the first 4 years. What I'm going to try to do is get it on the right path to getting it fixed, and hope to get it fixed in 8. And if we could do that, that would be a home run, if we're just not adding to the debt anymore. Because then, as our economy grows, we'll be able to pay off some of that debt, like you would do in your house. Like, okay, I got more money at the end of the month because I cut my expenses in other places, so now I can pay off the credit card. I can pay down the mortgage. And that's what we have to do. And it's hard, but I have the experience like nobody else has in doing it and recognizing it's going to hurt you politically. But 3 years later, I got reelected with 60% of the vote in a blue state. So I must have done something right. And I think what I did right was I kept my word. They didn't agree with every program I cut, but they were like, you know what? He told us when he ran, this is what he was going to do. And shit, if he didn't do it. So now we can't really be pissed at him for having done it. And I think that's the rationale you have to get back to in leadership. It's like, tell people what you're going to do. If they elect you, then do it. They're daring you to. So go and do it. And you know what? If you lose, you lose. Like, look, the way I felt every year in my first term as governor was, I care about being a governor of consequence. And if I lose, no one expected me to win in the first place. I beat an incumbent Democratic governor in a state that hasn't elected a Republican to the U.S. Senate in 50 years. He was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and he outspent me in the campaign $33 million to $11 million. and I beat him. So no one expected me to win in the first place, including me. So when you get there, you say to yourself, well, hell, man, just do it, because you're probably going to be here for 4 years, and just do what you can do in 4 years. I would take the same approach as president. Like, let's go. Let's do the best we can in 4 years. I'll run for election. If I lose, I lose. But at least in the 4 years that I was there, I would have done something that matters, does something of consequence. And the joke I used to say all the time in New Jersey was, look, I don't care about getting reelected, because once you win once, you already get the portrait. Right? They're already painting you. Someone made a painting of me. It's ridiculous. I got a painting, and it's hanging in the State House in New Jersey right now. And if I ever have grandkids someday, they're going to be able to go and see it and go, man, look at that. The old man did something. All you're arguing about then is the little brass plaque, whether it says 4 years or 8 years underneath it. I'm not selling my soul for the little brass plaque. So that's the way we go about it. It's going to be hard because we got here in a way that was wholly irresponsible. 8 years ago, Trump came up to New Hampshire and he said, I'm a businessman who balances budgets, and I will balance this budget in 4 years. And in 4 years, he added the most debt in 4 years that any president has added in the country's history. Look, if you want to figure out Donald Trump in this race, whatever he tells you he's going to do, take the 180-degree opposite. And that's what you're going to get. Remember, he said last time, I'm going to build a big, beautiful wall on the whole border of Mexico. And I can do it because I'm a builder. I build things. I know how to do this. I'm going to build that wall. Well, in 4 years, he built 52 miles of new wall. So he only needs another 110 years as president to finish at that pace. And Mexico hasn't paid a dime for it. Now, here's the interesting thing. Last week, come on in. There are seats in here. Come on up. Come on up. I will wait for you. This answer going to take a little bit anyway. So come on up. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4 seats up here. There's some seats right back here, too. Yep, right over here. So please, come on in. Look, he said just a week ago, he said, anybody who believed me when I said that Mexico was going to pay for the wall is dumb. There was no legal mechanism for me to force them to pay for the wall. I'm like, well, hell, man, that's what we were all saying 8 years ago. But you said it like 2,000 times. You actually got people to believe it. He is a liar. It's just that simple. He's a liar. He will tell you anything he thinks will get you to vote for him, or if you're a prosecutor, to leave him alone, that he thinks he can get away with. And 8 years ago, he fooled a bunch of people. I voted for him too. But we can't let him fool us this time, because the ramifications are too big. And if you think I'll give you one other story about him. When I was governor going through all that stuff, I knew him very well. He called me and he said, hey, I read about that deficit you have. How the hell are you going to fix that? I said, oh, I'm going to have to cut a lot of programs. He goes, no, don't do that. I got an idea for you. I said, okay, Donald, what's the idea? He goes, go bankrupt. And I said, well, I'm a state. I'm not, the law doesn't permit me to declare bankruptcy. He said, do it anyway. And he said, and by the time they get done fighting you in the courts, they will have forgotten about the whole thing, and you just look like you were fighting it, and then you can fix the problem then, because they'll give you a lot of leeway to do it, but just declare bankruptcy. I mean, like, just break the law. Go ahead, who cares? It was a preview to what we were going to get. And so we need to fight that, and that's part of the reason I'm out here doing it. So these problems are hard, you're right. But we've got to set priorities, and we've got to stop spending as much as we're spending. And when you look at what we're spending in foreign aid, it is less than 1% of the overall federal budget. So even if we eliminated all of it, it would be a drop in the bucket. What we really need to do is to go after the big ticket items. We have to reform the Pentagon. We spend a lot on defense, and we don't get nearly as much back for everything that we spend. And we got to do better at that. And I would appoint a Secretary of Defense who is someone who knows how to manage a big budget and go in there and figure it out with me, because we shouldn't be paying $780 billion in last year's Pentagon budget, and some of our military are on food stamps. This is unacceptable to me. I'm sorry. There shouldn't be any man or woman who is enlisted in the United States military who doesn't have enough money to eat and feed their family. That's a disgrace. And that means we're wasting money someplace. So we need to reconfigure how all that works, and that's one of the biggest pots of money that we need to take a look at. Yes, ma'am.
So in addition to cost cutting and, budget, don't you think we need to do a better job of collecting taxes, modernize the IRS? I mean, I've read stories that every dollar spent, increases like by $6 what we bring in. So bring in the revenue there too.
We definitely do, and I think one of the ways we need to do it is to make the tax code much simpler. Like, there's two ways to do it, right? You can either hire a lot more IRS agents and other folks because the code as it is so complicated that you really need, because I did a bunch of tax cases when I was U.S. attorney, and when you go after the really wealthy in this country, which we did in my office on tax evasion, you wouldn't believe the stuff they do. Like,
Carried interest.
right, well, carried interest, and that's part of an even bigger issue. So that's what I'm saying. Here's the choice. Keep the current tax code and hire a lot more people to try to enforce it, or simplify the tax code, which is what I think we should do. Get rid of stuff like that, like carried interest. Get rid of everything. I would be in favor of getting rid of everything except for things like the home mortgage deduction that most Americans use, and we want to encourage people to be able to buy homes and afford to buy homes and do that. But look, we got rid of, people never thought we would get rid of the state and local tax deduction. But we now capped it at $10,000. Believe me, for me in New Jersey, that killed me. Killed me. I mean, my property taxes just remain seated. My property taxes this year are $40,000.
I used to live in New Jersey.
Right? So you can, right? So you can relate to it, right? I mean, but I was for the elimination of the state and local tax deduction, and still am for it, because people in New Hampshire should not have to pay for the irresponsibility of government in New Jersey. If New Jersey is going to keep raising taxes, I shouldn't be able to deduct 35% of my taxes and you have to pay for it. Because it's a zero-sum game. Like, if I'm paying less, you're paying more. It all has to come out in the wash. So to me, I would flatten out this tax code significantly and make it simple for people. So, my father's a CPA. He hates this argument. I say I should be able to fill out my tax forms without having an accountant. He's like, that's the way you were raised. What the hell are you talking about? Like, you wouldn't have been able to eat if the people did that. Well, I'm like, sorry, Dad. This is the way I feel about it politically. But that's what we need to do. So I agree with you that we can do better on revenue collection. But I think the way to do it is to stop giving people so many opportunities to cheat and make it real simple. And I think the simpler we make it, the fairer it is to everybody. It would mean lower rates, but it would mean getting rid of the majority of those deductions, which keeps every lobbyist in Washington fat and happy, right? So I think you're on the right track, and I'd rather do it by making government smaller rather than bigger. So it's just a different approach, but I hope to the same result. Yes, sir.
So one of Trump's legacies is the Supreme Court. What type of individual would you look for to be justices and on lower courts?
Yeah, look, I'm a recovering lawyer, so I have a lot of familiarity with this. Look, one of my predecessors as U.S. Attorney in New Jersey is Justice Alito. And so I've gotten to know Justice Alito really well over the years. I admire him. I think he's smart, and I think he's fair, and I think he's honest. And so I'd be looking for folks like that. I'm looking for people with practical experience who are conservative. And by that I mean someone who looks at the Constitution and reads what the Constitution says, doesn't imagine what they wish it said or what they hope they meant, but what it actually says. And I want someone in the lower courts in the same way. That would be people of experience and of integrity who would read the law as it's written and enforce the law as it's written. Judges are not supposed to write law. Judges are supposed to interpret law. Now, our branches were set up with a very distinct set of responsibilities. Congress writes the laws, the president signs and enforces the laws, and the courts interpret the laws and make sure that justice is done. So I'd be looking for folks, if you look for a judge, I'd look for folks like Alito. And in a broader sense, I would be looking for people who had integrity, who are willing to enforce the law as it's written, not as they wish it were written. I used to say to judges all the time when I was U.S. attorney, they'd say, well, we think this is what should happen. I'm like, no. That's not your job to figure out what you think should happen. What does happen based on the law the way it's written. So that's the way I would try to do it. I think in the main, Trump did a pretty good job on the folks that he picked for the Supreme Court. I like Justice Barrett in particular. I think she's someone who is going to wear well over the course of time. And I think President Bush picking Chief Justice Roberts was a good choice as well. And so, those are the kind of judges I would look for in general. If you look at their records, that's what I would be looking to do.
Governor, I suspect we're all here because we're reasonable folks who want a reasonable dialogue. How do we bring the rest of the party into this room? We have a Speaker of the House that does not believe in separation of church and state. Most of the Republican Party does not believe in a peaceful transition of power. These are things that were undisputed 20 years ago, let alone when I was a kid. Like, how do you see this playing out? Like, thank you for being a voice that's kind of screaming somewhat alone at times, I
Yep.
suspect. Like, how do we bring them in?
Well, look, I think the first thing is you got to show you can win. Right? So, that's why New Hampshire is so important and why I'm spending almost all my time here, is because more people will vote here than in other places because you allow undeclared voters to vote in the primary. I think that's really important. And we have a much broader pool to choose from here than, let's say, in Iowa, where it's a closed caucus. So that's why this is so important and why you're all so important, because you can change this. Because, look, the emperor has no clothes. We just have to prove it to people. And a lot of people are with Trump just because they think he's inevitable. And people want to be with the winner. Like, oh, I don't want to waste my vote. As if voting for someone you believe in who loses is a wasted vote. Like, I never quite understood that, but I've heard plenty of people say it. It's not about wasting your vote. This is about spending your vote in a wise way. And I think if we were able to beat Donald Trump up here or come very close to him, everyone would say, oh my gosh, the reasonable people vote. And yeah. Huh? Well, it's certainly not something I haven't been asked before. So I am a little prepared for it. But I think, look, in the end, that's what it's about, and that's what you all have to do. And I appreciate the fact that you're here tonight on a Thursday night to show support and to ask questions and to learn more about exactly what I'd be like. But I think that if we want to change our party, my slogan when I ran for governor the first time in New Jersey was, if you want to change Trenton, change governors. You can't change all of Trenton at one time, but if you want to change Trenton, change governors. I would say the same thing about our party. If you want to change the Republican Party, change nominees. Because we know we stick with the same nominee, we're going to get the same garbage. But worse, because now he's pissed. The first time you elected him, he was pretty happy. Now he's pissed. He's like, I will be your retribution. I want you to remember the difference between Donald Trump in 2016 and Donald Trump in 2024. In 2016, he said, I am your voice. In 2024, he says, I am your retribution. He ain't going to be your retribution. He's going to be his. Thank you. He's going to be his. I was wondering when someone was going to notice that. I'm like, I only have like 8 staff here. Maybe someone could bring me some water at some point. Look up from your phones and see that my voice is going. Thank you, Carl. You get the gold star of the evening. He won't be your retribution. He'll be his. And that's what this will be, 4 years of him exacting retribution against every person who didn't agree that the election was stolen. It's not the kind of America I think we want to live in. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Governor. You spoke a lot about Donald Trump this evening, and I didn't disagree tell us how you distinguish yourself compared to the rest of the field?
Sure.
And really, why we should
Be with me rather than the others. Yeah. Well, first off, you're going to watch the stage on Wednesday night, I hope, from Miami, and watch us competing with each other on the stage. And maybe Vivek will shut up long enough to let the rest of us talk, which would be really nice. But look, let me take them one by one from the way they were standing the last debate. So right next to me was Nikki Haley. Look, I have great respect for Governor Haley. We've known each other now for 13 years. I went down and campaigned for her in 2010. I was an incumbent governor and went down and campaigned for her, and I'm proud to have played a small role in helping her get elected the first time, governor of South Carolina. Here's my two main distinguishing points with Nikki. Number one is that she worked in a red state with a red legislature and in a one newspaper state. Man, if you think that prepares you for Washington, D.C., you got another thing coming. And if you think going to the UN and raising your hand every time the White House told you to raise your hand and not raising your hand every time they told you not to gives you foreign policy experience, all it does is give you experience at raising or not raising your hand. Because all you're doing is reading the instructions that they tell you to do. I don't think that makes her a foreign policy expert. No, it's true. No, it's absolutely true. No, look. No, and I'll say it because it's true. Because I've known a lot of UN ambassadors, and they don't answer for themselves. They are instructed first by the Secretary of State and ultimately by the President of the United States. And of course I would have. Because you'll wait to see what I say about the other men. Okay? But it has nothing to do with her being a woman at all. It simply doesn't. I mean, look, she raises her hand when she does it on her own accord, and she did it on the first debate stage to say she would support a convicted felon for President of the United States. That has nothing to do with her being a woman, because every other man but me and Asa Hutchinson raised their hands on that too. And why'd she do that? How can you support a convicted felon for President of the United States and run against him at the same time? And I'm glad you brought it up, because it brought me into my second point about her in answer to your question, which is that I don't know where she stands on Donald Trump. Because she, in 2020, said he was such a good president that if he decided to run in 24, she wouldn't run. Then, after January 6th, her first response was, he will be harshly judged by history and has no role in leading this party again. Then 2 weeks later, after she went to Mar-a-Lago, she said, we should just give him a break. It wasn't his fault. Then she decided to run against him when she said she wouldn't. But then she got on stage and said she'd support him if he was a convicted felon. All I want to know is, what do you really think? Like, it's a perfectly acceptable position to say you would support Donald Trump as a convicted felon, I guess. Although I suspect that our founders, if they knew that anybody would have the audacity as a convicted felon to run for president, would have put that in with 35 years of age and a natural-born American citizen. Like, don't be a convicted felon. So my problem with her is twofold. It's one, that I think her experience as governor does not prepare her to be president from being in a red state and having a legislature that does pretty much whatever you want, and one newspaper that is the only place that scrutinizes you. And secondly, that if you're unwilling to take a stand on Donald Trump, then what will you be willing to take a stand on? She didn't take it down. She relocated it to another part. That's what she did. She took it off the top of the State House and she put it on the State House grounds to another place. Now, I don't know if you think that is demeaning the Confederate flag. If I made the decision, it would have gone in the basement, because it doesn't represent what's good about this country. It represented an awful, awful part of our history that shouldn't be honored. It shouldn't be ignored. It should always be recognized as part of our history, but it shouldn't be honored. And I don't know, that to me seems like, again, what we're talking about, kind of halfway being on something. I'll take it off the top of the building, but I'll keep it on the ground so everybody can see it and make it still a part of being honored on these grounds. So all I want to know is where she stands on Donald Trump. Is she against him? Would she be for him even if he was convicted of a crime? I think that's trying to have it both ways. And when you're president, you don't get to have it both ways. You got to make a decision. You're the decider. The buck does stop there. And so you've got to take decisions. And she also, by the way, said she's inclined to pardon him if he's convicted. Now, I got to tell you something. I gave pardons as governor, and so did she. And there are two requirements for every pardon. One is that you believe that somehow the result of the trial was unfair to the person. I don't know how the hell we could decide that now since there wasn't a trial. And two, the person must show remorse for what they did. Now, I got to tell you, if you're taking odds on whether that'll ever happen, I think they're pretty long that Donald Trump will ever show remorse. Yet she's saying she's inclined to pardon him. That's sending a signal to Trump supporters. I don't think it's so bad. But on the other hand, saying I'm going to run against him. It's back and forth. And so that's my problem and the distinction with Governor Haley. You will not have to wonder where I stand. You may not agree with it, but you won't have to wonder about it. And I won't be trying to have it both ways. I will say where I stand and what I think. And if it makes you not vote for me, I got to live with that. But I'd rather live with that than live with you wondering what I thought. And you thought it was one way, and then I do the other. And I go, well, no. That's not what I really meant. What I really meant was this. Governor DeSantis. Him I really don't understand. Because I think in this business you got to like people. And every bit of evidence I've seen is I don't really think he does. His interaction with people is very difficult and very awkward, and I think that's very hard to be a leader and not be willing to interact with people in a way that makes them feel welcome to ask you questions, to question your leadership, to question your judgment. Your citizens who you serve should have the ability to do that. Second, he has the same problem Nikki has, coming from a red state with a red legislature. And really, he rules the roost down there even more than Nikki did in South Carolina. That legislature does whatever the heck he tells them to do, or at least they used to. I think if he loses and he goes back there, he's going to find it a little bit different, but it's not going to prepare you to deal with a divided Congress. And I think he does things that are obviously just for political advantage, So when you go after Disney, whether you like Disney's position, like he went after Disney because they opposed a bill that he was in favor of. Man, if I went after every company in New Jersey who opposed something I was in favor of, I would have no time to do anything else. They have a right too. If Disney opposes that bill, they have a right to say they're opposed to that bill and to fight against it. That's what our democracy is about. And not worry that government is going to penalize them for their opinion. But that's exactly what he did. Exactly what he did. He all of a sudden, after 4.5 years as governor, decided he didn't like the tax breaks Disney got. Did he not know about them beforehand? It's the single biggest employer in the state of Florida who has a deal that nobody else had in the state of Florida. They had their own governmental entity that they controlled that decided the zoning in their entire area of Orlando and decided what taxes they would pay. It was a great deal. They got given a long time ago, and he knew about it. No governor could not know that the biggest employer in their state has their own governing entity. And when they went and opposed what he wanted to do, he went after them and he took it away from them and penalized them. Don't tell me it was because you just found out about it. You're penalizing them for having an opinion that's different than yours. I don't think that's the kind of president we want. Is someone who will use the levers and the power of government to try to control other people's opinions. And that's what he did. And if he'd do it as governor, sure as heck he would do it as president. So that concerns me about him and that kind of conduct. And lastly, he's also in the gang of I'll support a convicted felon. Now, to give him credit, he did cheat off everybody else's paper before he raised his hand. I don't know if you saw the debate that night, right? They say, raise your hand if you'd support it. And people were, a couple of them, Nikki, Tim, Vivek raised their hand right away. Ron was in the middle. He looked that way, then he looked down that way, and see how many were, and then he went, all right. Like, I mean, that also tells you something, doesn't it? Like, look, this is not a hard call, and nobody would be surprised we got asked about it. And you got to, like, look at what everybody else is doing before you decide whether to put your hand up or not. Like, come on. Tim Scott, who I've known for a long time as well, and I have a lot of respect for as well. I just don't think that being a United States Senator trains you to be president. And I think that we've seen that recently with both the current occupant of the White House and Barack Obama. It's different running a Senate office of 30 or 40 people and being the chief executive of the United States. And I think we need people who have some executive experience before they take that job and who have shown that they know how to handle a big enterprise. And I think that's Tim's biggest difference with me, is I've done that and Tim hasn't. And that doesn't mean Tim can't be a big contributor to a government. I think he could be. Because I think he's bright and he's articulate and he knows a lot about the topics. But, man, when you get at the head of that huge train, you better know how to drive it. And I think Tim doesn't necessarily know how to do that. I'm not even going to spend time on Vivek. Like, seriously. I mean, he's 38 years old. He claims to have, I heard him say the other day on TV, unfortunately, the drug I discovered didn't treat Alzheimer's the way we thought it would. He didn't discover any drug. He's a patent troll. He looks around for patents that haven't worked so far. He buys them cheap, and then if he can turn them around, he can make some money off of it. A perfectly legitimate business, but it doesn't make you a discoverer of a drug, right? And he says things like that make me feel like he thinks we're not smart, that we can't think these things through. And as I said earlier, he said this week that he would make a deal with Putin. The deal was, you can have the land in Ukraine. We'll promise you we'll never put Ukraine in NATO. And in return, don't talk to China anymore. I mean, like, really? Two committed communist dictators, Putin and Xi, are not going to talk to each other anymore, and Putin's going to come talk to us and be our friend. I mean, like, that should end that conversation. I think the difference there is I'm in the real world and he's not. And I don't really know why he's running. I really don't, but he's in there. He's still in the debates, so we're going to have to deal with him, and we'll deal with him. But I don't think there's any realistic chance he'd be nominated or elected president. And I think that's everybody that's really practically left in the race. I mean, I think Asa and Doug are still in. I have a lot of respect for both of those guys, too. I served with both of them as governors. They're, again, really bright guys, but I don't think they've really caught on in any respect anywhere, and probably, we'll probably be out of the race pretty soon, as the vice president did just last week. So I think, I'm giving you thumbnails. I mean, if we spent time on each one of them, I could talk more in detail about policies and other things, but the thumbnail on each one of them, I think those are the differences. You need somebody who's been through this, who's been through dealing with a difficult legislature, who's been through dealing in difficult media markets, who knows what it's like to have to lead under really challenging, withering type of circumstances. And, when Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey and destroyed 346,000 homes in 24 hours, you better be on your game and know how to run a government in order to get the lights back on, to get homes rebuilt, to get people back in their businesses. And we did that, and I'm really proud of how we did it. And it prepared me, I think, not for everything you'd confront as president, but it gave me the framework of how you have to deal with really, really big problems that seem completely overwhelming. I remember coming back because it just happened now, it was 11 years ago this weekend. I remember coming back after the first morning after the storm, and I went, to our emergency operations center, and my staff went around the table. I said, okay, what's the conditions? 346,000 homes have been destroyed. 2/3 of the state has no power of any kind, and we have no hope of getting it back for probably 2 weeks. Every major state highway is obstructed. Every school in the state is closed. We have no operating water treatment or wastewater treatment plants anywhere in the state. The nuclear plant at Oyster Creek is in danger of meltdown, and we have to figure out how to cool the core. Oh yeah, and by the way, only 53 gas stations are open and operational in the entire state. And those are the ones I remember off the top of my head. And Mary Pat said to me, so how did it go? And I said, well, let me tell you, I've now figured out when you know for sure you're governor. And she said, how's that? I said, they go around, they say all that stuff around the table, and then they all shut up. And they just look at you, and they go, okay, now what, genius? What are we doing? Here are the problems, now what do you want us to do? And I mean it honestly. I was 2.5 years into the governorship, and that was the first moment where I definitively felt the weight of the job I had. The budget things were really hard, but I always felt like I had that kind of in hand and could figure it out. We had pension issues that we dealt with, and we wrestled those to the ground and saved $120 billion on our public pension system by making real reforms. But that moment, I'll tell you, I sat there and said, oh my God, what do I do? And you learn. And you learn. And that kind of experience, they don't put it in the new governor's manual. You just got to figure it out. And I think that experience is much different than the experience that any of the rest of the folks have had in their careers as well, which has helped to make me better prepared for that job than the others who were up there. And you'll have to make that evaluation, but I think you'll see those traits come through on the stage as well in terms of how you answer questions and whether you're really being spontaneous and unrehearsed or whether you're being rehearsed. Because if you're rehearsed, it's more because you're afraid to be unrehearsed. And that should give you some pause, I think. Yes, sir.
Governor Christie, China's clearly our biggest foreign policy challenge and our biggest competitor. What would your policy be once you become president dealing with China? And do you plan to keep the same, what Biden's doing, semiconductors, trade war, etc., or do you try to change some of that policy?
Well, I don't think the tariffs have been effective. And I think they contribute to inflation. Because all they're doing is raising prices on both sides and contributes to worldwide inflation, which is really bad for us as the biggest economy in the world. We suffer under it more than anybody else will, more than the Chinese or anybody else in the world. We have to find a constructive relationship with China, but it has to be done through strength because that's what they respect. If you show them weakness, they'll take advantage of it. And I think the Chinese are much better long-term planners than we are as a government. Now, it's easier for them because it's a dictatorship, so they can make the long-term plan enough to clear it with anybody, like a Congress or the people who actually vote for you. But we have to deal with that. It is a reality. Whether we like it or not, it's a reality. So I do agree with starting to try to bring back on shore manufacturing that is essential to national security and public health. It's impossible when some of my adversaries will say, we are going to bring all of our manufacturing home. Like, it's not going to happen. Like, you just can't. You're taking what's been a 50-year evolving relationship with China and saying you're going to reverse it in a year. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's not going to happen. But I do think what should happen is on things like semiconductors and other things that involve national security, and what we learned in COVID, how much of our pharmaceuticals and our PPE and all the rest of it are manufactured in China, and we had to be asking like Mother May I to get some of that stuff during COVID. I don't think we should leave ourselves in that kind of position again. And I think we relied too much on Chinese manufacturing, and we did it because of cost. And let's face it, our capitalist system was looking for the lowest cost, and China offered the lowest cost because what they were looking for was volume. They wanted to employ people and create a middle class in China. So it almost looked like a perfect marriage to corporate America until we had a couple of crises, and all of a sudden now you're going, wait a second. They're going to actually control that stuff and not give it to us? So I think we have to onshore manufacturing of national security, and not all of it, but enough so that we have a plan B in case things go sideways like they did during COVID, or they could do in any one of these conflicts that we might have. I'm not a big fan of the tariffs because I just don't think they've worked. Have they markedly changed China's behavior in the world anywhere? I'd argue too that's aggravated it in some respects. And so I'm not like philosophically against tariffs. I'm not an economist. But what I am is I'm against things that don't work. And that all they do is cause more price increases for our consumers. If I could say to the American people, look, this is now going to cost 10% more, but it's going to control China's behavior, probably a trade most Americans would make. But if I say to them, it's going to cost 10% more, and it's not working, but it feels good, because we're saying we're banging them with tariffs, you know. That's, again, TV tough guy stuff. So what we need to do is to reconfigure our relationship with China on both the economic side and the military side. How do we do it? On the economic side, I think we go to them and say, all right, you made trade deals with us, by the way, where you said you would buy a certain amount of soybeans and a certain amount of corn and all the rest, and you've only, complied with about 25% of it. We'll get rid of the tariffs in return for you complying and buying the things from us that you said you were going to buy to help American farmers and keep American farmers upright and producing the greatest food supply in the world. We can do things like that and trade that stuff up, but it has to be fair trade-offs that we do economically. Militarily, the only thing we can do is, look, the Chinese Navy is now larger than ours. It's the only part of the military that is larger than ours, but it is now larger. We can't have that because they will then try to use that advantage to control the shipping lanes in the South China Sea. So militarily, I think what we have to do is show them that we have the resolve to keep up. So we're in the same spot, that we were in back in the 80s when Reagan said we have to show the Soviets we're willing to do that. And we eventually wore the Soviets down over a 10-year period and knocked them out. We're not going to do that to China. But if you asked me today, would I trade straight up our economy for their economy, knowing what I think will happen in the future? No chance. Because our population is aging, but theirs is aging, and as you know, getting much smaller because a lot of the policies, the social policies that China implemented years ago. Our population is still growing, not as fast as I think I'd like to see it, but it's still growing. They are going to have a problem, and they're in the midst of it right now, where, conditions are declining for the middle class in China. That's going to be a problem because you can continue to control people politically when they're fed and they feel like they're making some progress. But if that starts to go the other way, they're going to be looking for somebody to blame. And a communist dictatorship is a pretty nice target to blame when you feel like you don't even know what's going on in the rest of the world because your flow of information is controlled, your freedom of movement is controlled, freedom of choice in your careers to some extent are controlled. So those things you can deal with, I think, when people are feeling like they're making progress. They start to not make progress, and you look at some of the horrific deals that have happened in real estate over there. I mean, they have whole cities that were built where no one lives in them. And they've got all that debt to go with it. It's extraordinary. So they've got some problems. I wouldn't trade right now. Knowing that, we should feel confident about our competition with them economically and not look for ways to continue to have conflict, but look for ways where we can continue to press our advantage. And if it means they grow too, okay. As long as they just stay a little bit behind us, I'm fine. That's all. Let them grow. Let us grow too. Because we can't avoid the fact that we will be the two dominant countries in the world for at least the next 50 years. That's where we're going. And so, all right, let's try to compete. Let's try to outcompete them the same way we outcompeted the Soviet Union. Let's try to do the same thing. And if we can do that, then our next 3-4 generations will be okay. And that's probably all that we can all worry about at the moment. We can't look a whole lot further than 3 or 4 generations ahead. But I think that's the way I would deal with China. And I'd hope to develop a relationship with Xi, who seems like he's going to stay there interminably. It's just got his 3rd term, what I'm sure was a very competitive election. Yeah, behind the scenes, very competitive. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'd like to try to develop a relationship with him of mutual respect, where we say to each other, look, we're competing. I don't agree with a lot of what you do. He won't agree with a lot of what I do. But we don't need to blow up the whole world over it. And I think that's the way to go. Banging our chest every day may feel good, but I want to see it lead to results, and I haven't seen that yet. And I'm surprised, actually, that Biden's continued the policies that he's continued. So I thought he'd change them, but he hasn't, I think mostly for political reasons. That was my first indication he was definitely running for re-election. He didn't change those policies. So I was like, okay, he's worried about exposing a flank of his. We should be more concerned about trying to get it right. We are worried about that. Yes, ma'am. Well, I've already said if he's a convicted felon, I wouldn't vote for him. And I think he's inevitably to be a convicted felon. I don't think I could vote for Joe Biden because I don't think he's physically or mentally capable for the job today. There's no chance I vote for Robert Kennedy Jr. He's crazier than Trump. So, I really don't know. I don't think I probably wouldn't. If Trump's convicted, Biden is who he is, and Robert Kennedy's the other choice, I probably wouldn't vote for president. I can't imagine a world where he isn't. I really can't. He's got his chief of staff testifying against him. Like, I can't imagine a scenario now where he's not convicted. This is the guy who was standing with him every day during the election and the post-election period. And to get immunity, because I know I would have never given anybody immunity, whether they had, if they didn't have devastating testimony that was corroborated by things in writing. Because they're going to get impeached on the stand, no matter what, because they got immunity. So you're going to have things that back it up in writing. And I don't think, knowing this prosecutor, he wasn't careless about that, about giving away immunity. I probably wouldn't. For president, but they were going to vote the rest of the ticket, I'd say vote your conscience. I mean, look, I know I've grown tired of voting for the least objectionable alternative, right? I really have. I've grown tired of it. Look, I justified my support for Trump in 2016 by saying I can't have Hillary Clinton as president. And by the way, I still stand by that. I couldn't imagine Hillary Clinton as president. I don't want to imagine it. And so I volunteered to support Trump. I worked for him. I prepared him for the debates. I was his transition chairman. I did everything I could to try to get him elected, and I did. And he disappointed me. But then he's running against Biden. Now I'm sitting there going, now what do I do? So I voted for him again. And then he's going off like a lunatic about the election being stolen. And by the way, did you hear what he said this week in Iowa? He said, you all have to go out and vote for me here in Iowa because the other people in the race are trying to steal it from me. He's already setting it up, guys. He's already setting it up. Like that me, Nikki, Ron, Tim, we're now the thieves that are going to try to steal it from him. And don't forget, in 2016, when he lost Iowa to Cruz, he came here and said Cruz stole it from him in Iowa. Like, so I can't, and the worst part for me is what he did as president during the election. I mean, I was sitting on the set at ABC that night as a commentator, and when he came out at 2:30 in the morning and said the election's been stolen, when not even all the votes had been counted yet. I said, I turned to George and I said to him, George, come to me right out of the speech. And he said, why? I said, I will not disappoint you. And I went right after him. And as soon as we went to commercial, man, my phone rang. And he was hot. And so was his son. And I'm like, look, this is beneath the office you hold. You're standing in the East Room of the White House behind the seal of the President of the United States telling the American people the election was stolen when you have no basis to say that. And millions of Americans, I thought so at the moment, that what has happened was going to happen. Millions of Americans are going to believe you because they figure you're President of the United States. You must know something we don't know. Little did they know he doesn't know anything they don't know, at least about that. So yeah, if my kids came to me and said they weren't going to vote, I'd say, no, you got to vote your conscience on this one. And I'm tired of just supporting the least objectionable alternative. I'd like to actually vote for someone. And if he's convicted of a felony, there's no chance I could vote for him. And I know now he's going to be convicted. And Biden, I just look at him and look, this is the way I feel about Biden, because I've known him for 40 years. I went to the University of Delaware. I served on the board of the university. He's an alum from there as well. And he's a very nice man. I like Joe Biden a lot as a person. He's been a very nice person that I've gotten to know over the years. But if I were his son, I'd go to him, put my hand on his shoulder and say, Dad, you did great things for this country. Great things. But it's time to go home. This isn't right anymore. You need to go home. Don't run again. If you really, really loved your father and you watch the way he struggles every day to do what he can do under the stress of that job, I don't understand how family members don't look at him and say, like, it's time to go home. And what it makes me worry about is that they don't want him to go home. Because they're on the grift. They're on the grift. They're making money off his name. The same way the Trump kids are making money off his name, by the way. And now all of them, you see them up in this civil trial going on, they all got amnesia now. Oh, I never saw any financial statements. No, I never had anything to do with that. No, never talked to me about that. Like, come on. This is bad stuff. So it's an awful answer to a good question, but it is the answer. I'm not voting for a convicted felon, and I'm not voting for a guy who I don't believe is mentally or physically capable to do the job. And if those are the two choices we have, that's it. But that's why I'm here, because I don't want that to be the two choices. Yeah.
My 80-year-old dad, before Chief Justice had, what do you want me to ask Governor Christie? And he said, one, he misses you on Sunday mornings. But he said, why aren't you polling better? That's what he said. And he said, I like him. Why isn't he polling better?
Because I'm going after Trump.
Right, and I would add, this is a good conversation, because knowing that you know his playbook, and I think you do know his playbook
I do.
better than anybody.
Yep.
So what can we do to sort of, because I don't think anybody in this room, most people that I know, whether it's my 17-year-old daughter or my 80-year-old dad, everybody's pretty much fiscally, you need to be able to balance a checkbook. Socially, I don't think as many people care about that anymore, as long as we're not hurting other people. So I don't understand why candidates A don't run on that a little bit more, openly. And then, what do you do to sort of execute knowing his playbook?
The only thing you can continue to do is do what you're doing, right? Like, you just have to continue to work. Like, look, the other thing that, like, all of you being here, you're really showing off now, Carl. You're really showing off. The only thing you can do is keep working until people are paying attention. Like, all of you are here tonight, so obviously you're paying attention. But you know plenty of people in your life who still aren't. Who aren't going like, oh, yeah, I was listening to the news the other night, and I heard Governor Haley said this, and Governor Christie said that, but, DeSantis said that. It's the fourth quarter, but it's not the 2-minute warning yet. And so you got to just keep working. And that's why I brought up those polls from 8 years ago in October, right? Ben Carson was going to be president of the United States. Jeb Bush was going to be president of the United States. And don't forget, Hillary Clinton in 2008 was beating Obama at this point in October by 30 points. So you got to keep working in a state where it matters. If the first primary were California or New York or Florida or Texas, I'd be desperately worried. Because then the only thing that matters is how much money can you spend to get on the airways, because you can't possibly make your way around the states of those size to be able to have an impact on voters, and there's too many voters to have an impact on in a micro way. That's what makes this place so great. Today, my day today, I started in Keene. I went from Keene to Nashua. I went from Nashua to Derry. I went from Derry to Bedford, then from Bedford to Hanover. There's no other place in the early states where you can do that. I did Iowa 8 years ago. Forget it. Man, you get in the car, you do one stop, and your next stop's 3 hours later. And when you get done with the 3 hours, and the 3 hours are, let me tell you what it's like to drive in Iowa. You're on a 2-lane road, every once in a while a 4-lane road, corn, soybeans, windmills. Windmills, soybeans, corn, gas station. And then the same thing over and over and over again. Here, you have a chance to be able to do what I did today in the state in a day, to hit almost every part of this state in one day. That's what you can do. And I'm going to be here every week for the next 12 weeks, at least 2 days a week. Sometime by the end, we'll be here probably most days of the week. And I think it's the only thing you can do. And be here when people start to decide. And so for the people who are deciding early and who are interested, like all of you, be here and be talking to them. But then the crowds are going to get bigger and more complicated and all the rest as we get, after Christmas. Now, 8 years ago, we had 5 weeks after Christmas. This year, we're going to have 3. And so it's going to be really crazy. Get ready. You guys want to go into like a storm basement or something. We're going to be so all over you from January 1st to January 23rd. But that's why you compete here. Because you know what happens? If I were to beat Donald Trump here, the whole world changes. It's like an earthquake. If Nikki were to beat Trump here, it's an earthquake, right? So the whole idea, everything you think you know right now will change like that. He'll be saying we stole it. We'll be moving on to another state and trying to, put him in the rearview mirror, right? It'll all change, and that's the power of this state. That's the power of being the first in the nation, and that's the power of having a really open, transparent primary, where that's actually possible. I'll tell you, when I was thinking about running, I called President Bush 43, who appointed me to my job as U.S. Attorney and has really been a mentor to me in my political career, to ask him for advice. And he said to me, he goes, you can do well in New Hampshire. And I said, well, tell me why. He said, remember what happened to me in 2000? I was the front runner. He said, I won Iowa going away. And I was not behind in one poll in New Hampshire from the time I left Iowa until election night in New Hampshire, when I lost to McCain by 18 points. He said, I turned to Karl Rove and I said, what the hell happened? And he said, you lost independents by nearly 30. And most independents don't get polled in the Republican primary. So he said, just go up there and talk to everybody. Don't just talk to Republicans, talk to everybody. Because just about everybody, unless you're a registered Democrat, is eligible to vote in the Republican primary. And he said in my primary that year, they showed up. And they showed up for McCain. And the whole world changed then, right? Then all of a sudden it was a race. And Bush still ultimately won, but it was a struggle. And it put McCain in a position to become the nominee 8 years later, right? So I think that's, the way to do it. So tell your father, I don't like the polls either. Like, I much prefer polls when I'm ahead. Because, right? Call me out. I much prefer when I'm ahead. But I know from the history of the polling here that polling in October doesn't translate into polling in late January and early February, and a lot of stuff's going to happen. Like I said before, a lot of baseball left to be played between now and the end of it. So I could take 2 more, and I'm going to let everybody go home. Yes, sir. You came from the Dartmouth event. Way to go, buddy. Hi, Rick. I thought I recognized you. Thanks for coming.
I was wondering about what are your views or opinions on the American education system? I mean, during COVID, you saw that there was a great decrease in literacy rate, especially like with people my age.
Yep. Look, what we did during COVID was awful. Awful. We had evidence that people your age weren't really affected by COVID in any significant way, and yet we closed schools predominantly, went to at-home learning, which was not really learning. I mean, I watched my own kids, who were doing, 2 of them were in college, and I watched what they were doing. It was like ridiculous. But my youngest daughter was in a Catholic high school, all girls Catholic high school. They didn't close. I mean, they closed from March to June in 20, but in September they were back. And all through that winter they were back. these were the nuns running this thing. They said, put your coats on, and they would open all the windows in the winter in the classroom and had all the windows open, and they said, girls, put your coats on, and we know it's cold, but you're coming to school because it's the only way you're going to learn. So I think we did a great disservice during COVID, but it's bigger than that. Especially, let's separate K-12 education, higher education. In K-12 education, right now, 39% of our 8th graders don't read at grade level. And 25% of our 8th graders don't do math at grade level. And we spend $400 billion a year on K-12 education. Like, it's got to change. And I think the way it's got to change is we have got to make school choice universal and set up competition in every state to get your money to go to K-12 school. I think it's the only thing that will solve this problem now. We've got a situation where, because there's no competition, only people of means can make a choice. So, for instance, I went to public school. My wife went to parochial school growing up. So we got married, we had 4 children, and they all went to parochial school because that's the way decisions get made in my house. And I didn't object to it because I really felt like she made a good point, which was they're going to get just as good an education at parochial school as they will at public school, but they'll be supporting the values that we're trying to teach our children every day, not undercutting them. But I only got to make that choice because I was a lawyer and she worked on Wall Street and we had money so we could pay our $40,000 in property taxes and still afford to send our kids to parochial school and pay that tuition. Not everybody can do that, and it's wrong. We shouldn't have a 2-tiered system of education in this country. So I think the only way to fix it is to take the money we're spending and to put it in the hands of parents and let them choose. Because nobody cares about their children or loves their children more than their parents, and will make the best choices for them. Now, in higher education, the problem is less a lack of competition than it is cost. Now, we could talk about what's going on campuses right now like we did at Dartmouth earlier, and I think that some of the stuff that's being taught and some of the people that are being hired is just reprehensible, and I think university presidents and boards of trustees have to be held to account for that. The rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing on campuses across the country is completely unacceptable, and we send our kids there at 18 years old to learn, and they're being taught, at least in some respects, by people who are teaching them hateful stuff and convincing them that it's acceptable. And I think that's awful. But the bigger problem is how much it costs. So, for instance, I said my youngest daughter is a junior at Notre Dame. I was in the midst of the campaign in August when the tuition bill came. So I wasn't paying the attention I normally did. And my wife said, hey, that Notre Dame bill's here. You got to pay this. She's leaving for school in a week. And I went there. The bill for first semester Notre Dame tuition, room and board, fees was $40,200 for the first semester. Right? So I'm paying $80,000 a year to Notre Dame. My problem with it is not just that $80,000 is an incredible amount of money, but also my older daughter graduated from there in 2018. You know what her last year's tuition was in 2018? Was $62,000. How in the hell did it go from $62,000 to $80,000 in 6 years? Inflation wasn't that high during that period of time. The reason is because there's unlimited loan money. So there's no restriction on how because they say to you, oh, we raised it again, just borrow more money. Borrow more money, borrow more money. And so folks your age now, if you don't have parents who can help to pay most of it, are coming out of school with $300,000, $400,000 in debt. And then what can you do when you get out? It restricts what you can choose to do with your life because you got to start paying those loans. And I had loans because my parents didn't have the money to send me. And it took me 10 years to pay my loans back. But they were not hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans. They were a lot to me at the time, but I paid it. We need to set up a system of costs in this country where we say to these higher education institutions, you can raise your tuition and fees, your total cost at the rate of inflation. And if you raise it anymore, we're going to take away all your federal money. research money, your grant money, your Pell Grant money. And you know what'll happen? No one's going to that school. Because if you can't get Pell Grant money and you can't qualify for federal student loans, you're not going. We need to tell them, stop. You know, I made a joke here when I was here 8 years ago. I went to one of the colleges here in New Hampshire, and I was walking through their rec building to get to the auditorium where I was speaking, and they had one of those artificial rock climbing walls that was built. So it just made me think. I went in there and I said, you know, you all paid for an artificial rock climbing wall, and you live in the granite state. You got rocks everywhere to climb. Why don't you just go outside and climb the rocks? Like, we need to actually pay for building a wall inside the building so you can climb the rocks in the building. Now, it's a ridiculous example, but it's meant to be. Like, think about the things we're paying for, and also think about the fact that many of these schools, including the one you attend, although it's certainly not the highest offender in the Ivy League, have enormous endowments. Multi-billions of dollars in endowment. What are they doing with it? Exactly. So maybe tax-free. So maybe it's time has come to say, you know what? Your tuition goes up above the rate of inflation. Not only do you get federal money, we're going to start taxing the value of your endowment too. Right? Imagine at Harvard, they would fall over dead with all the money they've got there. And Yale, and Columbia, Princeton, Penn, right? And Notre Dame, because I know they got a big one there too. And my oldest son went to Princeton, so I know that one too, right? So, you know, we need to start doing that to make it more affordable for all of you. The quality of education that people are getting in our colleges and universities, in the main, is really pretty good. And the evidence of that is that you have people from all over the world want to come here and learn here. And so it's not the quality of the education, it's the values that we're teaching, but more than anything else, it's the cost. And that cost is unfair to place upon all of you or your families. It's out of proportion with the value of what you're getting. And at some point, when it's going to cost me $300,000 to put my daughter through 4 years at Notre Dame, after tax, you've got to make like $550,000 to be able to afford to pay that tuition by yourself, or you have to turn to your child and say, take on the debt if you want to go here. And neither one of those are really good choices for parents, and not fair to you. So, long answer to your question, but you came all the way from Dartmouth, so I figured I should give you the full answer. All right, take one more, and then we'll let everybody go if there is another one. Or did I exhaust you? Yeah.
So my daughter, I mentioned 17. She's looking to go to Europe for college. And it's a lot cheaper, obviously. Not that it's better, but it's a lot cheaper.
Yep.
And she wants to go to music school over there, which is great. So we're supportive of that. She lived over there in the UK for 6 months last year, and I really learned a lot more about their programs, which is you go to school till 10th grade, and then you either go to trade school or you go on to sixth form, which is, you know, if you're on the track to go to university.
Mhm.
Or you go work for a family business at that point. So you have to test in to go on
Right.
beyond.
Yeah.
So, you know, we are, especially in this community, dying for tradespeople. People, I mean, the cost, my realtor friend was telling me, it's almost $600 a square foot to build a house in this area. Now, we're on an island, obviously, you know, New Hampshire. But like, you know, being from Virginia, you know, it's not nearly, it's expensive, but it's not nearly that expensive. But the point is that we, you know, why don't we have a system like that where we're taking the people who maybe don't even want to go to college, but they don't know what, you know, they don't have any other avenue. And, you know, we're going tradespeople, like, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we making, you know, school, community college free? All these things that feel like could be done that would better the system.
Like, my opinion is that in the 60s, we made a cultural judgment that going to college was something of status that should be afforded to everybody. And it's just remained that way since then. And like, for me, you know, my dad was the first person in his family to ever go to college. And he went at night. He was, you know, he got back from serving in the Army during the Korean War. He came back, his father had passed away, There was no chance for him to go to college. At least he thought initially. He went to work at the Breyers ice cream plant in Newark, New Jersey. And he was on the line. There was an older guy next to him said, like, you're too smart to be here. What are you doing? Go to college. He goes, my dad passed away. My family has no money. I can't go to college. He goes, dummy, you're a veteran. You have the GI Bill. Go at night. And, like, you can continue to work and go at night. So my dad went to Rutgers in Newark at night for 6 years to become a CPA. My mother never went to college. My mother was a school secretary and then a curriculum coordinator and then a enrollment coordinator, right, in the school systems. But I was expected to go. Like, that's what I mean about the cultural change. Like, my father being the first one ever went, my mother never went, even in that house. My parents were like, you're going to college. Like, you're going to college because, right, you want to make you better, right? So that's, but what we need to learn is what you just said, which is it's not for everybody. And there's some people who just don't want to do it. And so it's not about necessarily even skill level some of the time. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's about intellect, but most of the time it's about choice. What do you want to do with your life? And I think we have to have a much greater emphasis on making it socially acceptable because the resources are there for people to go. And like in my state, community college is predominantly free now. And so people can go there and do that. But we need to encourage people that it is a good choice to go to trade school. It is a good choice to become a carpenter, to become a plumber, to become a pipe fitter, become an iron worker, to become a steel worker. Like, all these things are needed to be done, electricians and all the rest. And I think that it's about, having a system where we talk about that more as being acceptable, as an acceptable alternative. It's not something you're settling for. And that's a cultural change that we need to make. But I think you're going to see it start to come more and more with the combination of what the last answer was, which is the expense of second, undergraduate education, and the other thing that you brought up, which was the need for these folks and how that will drive pay. And it already does. I mean, it reminds me of like the movie Moonstruck from all those years ago, right? And Livia Dukakis was walking to this huge brownstone that they owned in Brooklyn, and this guy was walking her back from dinner, and he said, "Where do you live?" She goes, "That's my house right there." And he said, "The whole thing?" And she said, "Yeah, the whole thing. It's 3 stories." And he goes, "What's your husband do?" And she goes, "He's a plumber." And the guy looked at her and said, "Of course," right? Like, there is a great living to be made if you find that work rewarding. And even a better one now because of the lack of tradespeople, qualified, good tradespeople to be able to do this work. So I think it's a cultural change that we have to make, and that's about the president and others in leadership talking about that, going to trade schools. Like, it's amazing when I was governor. Like, if you showed up at a place, it was an enormous thing. Like, and you're still like a normal person, you think. Like, oh, okay, so I'm showing up at this trade school. It was like they had pictures of you there afterwards. They would tell the people about it. I was in like advertising material that this one particular trade school I went to visit put out. Like, Governor Christie came here and talked about the value of our education, and they used it to market. Like, you forget, and Jeb Bush reminded me of this before Hurricane Sandy. He called me the night before and he said, "Remember, don't let them keep you in an emergency operations center all day. Get out half a day every day for people to see you. You can't imagine how much it means to people to see you. It gives them comfort." And he was so right about that. It was great advice. And I think we forget sometimes how much influence a president can have by talking and showing up at places to change culture. I mean, John Kennedy, I remember reading an interview with him when he said in the State of the Union address that one year, "We are going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of the decade." And Walter Cronkite did an interview with him a year later, and he said, "So what's the plan?" He goes, "I don't know. It's not my job to make the plan. It's my job to set up the aspiration. And then it's for the really smart people to do it." That's what leadership's about. So if you're a president who believes that that should become a more acceptable option, then show that by where you show up. And be a president who goes to trade schools and visits and talks about the value of and the need of those folks. Work with the unions, the private sector unions, to elevate their position in the world and to say that a Republican can work with them. I did it in New Jersey. We worked with Democratic trades all the time, and it helped. So I think that's it. I think it's more than anything else cultural change that needs to happen, because you see it being done in Great Britain. It's not like, you know, they have a tradition of higher education, but their culture rewards different things.
I think it's very much an open, everybody respects whatever patent.
That's right.
Multiple patents.
As long as you're working hard, everybody respects it. I think that's it. Speaking of working hard, you're working hard being here. I'm working hard in front of this fireplace. It's been pretty hot back here. That's why I needed the water too. But look, I want to thank you for coming. And the last thing I'll leave you with is don't give up. Don't be despondent. You're not just Americans who have a right to decide who leads you. You're from New Hampshire. You really do get to decide. Like if you're from New Jersey, our primary is June 5th. If this thing ain't over by June 5th, it's going to be really interesting, right? If I get to my primary on June 5th and this thing's in doubt, you're going to have the most exciting spring you've ever seen in your life, right? But you all get to make a decision. Don't act like a victim. You're not. In politics, there are two types of people, victims and perpetrators. Be a perpetrator. Be someone who's going to make something happen for whoever you support. And look, I want you to support me. I want your vote. I'm asking you for your vote. But let me just say this. If you decide to vote for Governor Haley or Senator Scott or you know, Governor DeSantis, I'll be disappointed. But at least you're making a choice that moves our party forward in a different direction. I think the worst vote is a vote for Donald Trump because it takes us backwards. We need as a party and a country to move forward, away, with all due respect to the baby boomer generation. It's time. Pass the baton. It's time to go. You know, and let's be perpetrators. Make it happen. Talk to your friends. Talk to your neighbors. Talk to your coworkers. Tell them you've been here. Encourage them to come. And not only see mine, encourage them to go to Nikki's. Encourage them to go to Ron's. Listen, and you'll decide who your flavor is. But don't just take the default. You're better than that. And this state's always been better than that. And that's why I'm spending all my time here. It's not just the pleasant weather. It's that I'm spending my time here because I want to get your vote. So thanks for coming tonight and spending the time. Appreciate it.